In Dry Creek, the dust had a way of settling on a soul. It was a fine red powder, born from the colossal sandstone buttes that watched over the town like silent, disapproving gods. It coated the unpainted planks of the buildings, filled the lines in every face, and muted the world to a uniform shade of weary resignation. People said the dust got so thick after a while you could not tell who was white and who was Navajo anymore. But that was just a dry joke told over warm beer. Everyone knew the line. It was invisible, but it was as real and as sharp as a shard of glass in the sand. Eleanor Monroe knew the line well. She had lived on one side of it for the 5 years she was Captain Samuel Monroe's wife, and now, for 3 years a widow, she lived squarely upon it. Her world was the Monroe Eatery, a small establishment that was more grit than polish. Standing at the edge of town, it was the last piece of her husband she had left. This plot of unforgiving Arizona land he had bought with some wild notion of a future beyond the army. Now, the future was just Eleanor, the smell of frying bacon, and the constant effort of keeping the dust out. At 28, she wore her widowhood like a well-fitted dress, respectable, somber, and a little too tight in the chest. She was a woman alone, a fact that the men in Dry Creek treated as either an invitation or a problem to be managed, and the women as a source of pity and suspicion. She moved through her days with a quiet efficiency, her hands chapped from lye soap, her back aching from hoisting sacks of flour. She served watery coffee to dusty prospectors and stringy beef to tired cattlemen. She listened to their talk of gold strikes and Apache raids, her face a polite, neutral mask. She was a fixture, like the town well or the crooked sign on the saloon, necessary, but unremarkable. That night, the air was still and heavy, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the distant complaint of a coyote. Eleanor had just finished scrubbing the last pot, the lye stinging a small cut on her knuckle. The eatery was dark, save for the single lamp she carried, its golden light throwing long, dancing shadows across the wooden floor. She was tired down to her bones, a deep weariness that had little to do with the day's labor. It was the weight of solitude. She paused in the center of the room, her gaze falling on the empty chairs, the silent tables. This place was her fortress and her prison. The smell came first, not the familiar smell of wood smoke from a chimney, but something acrid and hungry. She frowned, lifting the lamp higher. A thin, greasy wisp of smoke curled from under the kitchen door. Her heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. She moved toward the door, her hand outstretched, and felt a blistering heat through the wood. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She fumbled with the latch, throwing the door open to a wall of heat and roiling black smoke. A grease fire. The stove was engulfed in orange flames that licked greedily at the wooden walls. In the seconds, she stood frozen. The fire leaped to a stack of dry linens, and the room erupted. The heat was a physical blow. Driving her back, she choked, her lungs filled with thick, searing smoke. The lamp slipped from her grasp and shattered on the floor, its oil feeding the inferno. Darkness and fire became one. She stumbled back into the dining room, her mind a frantic blur. The front door! She had to get to the front door, but the smoke was a blinding, suffocating blanket. It clawed at her throat, stung her eyes. She fell to her knees, crawling, her hands sweeping across the rough floorboards, searching for a landmark, a wall, anything. The roar of the fire was in her ears, a hungry beast consuming her world plank by plank. She could hear shouting from outside, faint and distant, the sounds of a world she was no longer a part of. Her strength was failing, the smoke was too thick. This is it, she thought, a strange, quiet resignation settling over her terror. This is how it ends, in dust and smoke. Then, a sound that was not the fire, a tremendous crash of splintering wood. The front door burst inward, ripped from its frame. A figure stood silhouetted against the hellish orange glow. A man framed in fire and chaos. He was not one of the townspeople. He was tall and lean, his form all hard lines and coiled strength. For a heartbeat, he was a spirit of the fire itself, a demon come to claim her. Then he moved. He moved with a fluid silence that was unnatural in the crashing roar. He was across the room in 3 long strides, his eyes scanning the floor. Eleanor tried to call out, but all that came was a strangled cough. He saw her. He bent down, and a strong arm slid beneath her shoulders, another under her knees. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. The arm across her back was bare, the skin warm and solid against her cotton dress. She had a fleeting impression of a hard, unyielding face, high cheekbones, and eyes that held the dark, flat intensity of obsidian. His black hair was long, tied back with a simple leather thong. He smelled of pine smoke in the open desert, a clean, wild scent that cut through the foulness of the fire. He carried her out into the night. The cool air was a shock, a blessing. He did not stop at the threshold, but continued past the small, gathering crowd of onlookers, their faces pale and shocked in the flickering firelight. He laid her gently on the ground a safe distance away, his touch surprisingly careful. She pushed herself up, coughing violently, her body trembling. Her eatery was a funeral pyre. Flames shot through the roof, painting the night sky in terrible shades of orange and red. The people of Dry Creek stood watching, a useless bucket brigade just beginning to form. They were staring, not just at the fire, but at her, and at the man who stood beside her. Tahan. She knew his name, though they had never spoken. He was one of the Navajo who lived in makeshift shelters beyond the town's edge, in the shadow of the Red Mountains. He came to town for supplies sometimes, moving with a quiet reserve that the townsfolk mistook for arrogance or menace. They called him a savage, a word they spat like tobacco juice. They told stories of his past, whispers of him being a scout for the army, a traitor to his own people, then a traitor to the whites. He was an outcast from every world, a man who walked alone, and he had just saved her life. Sheriff Miller pushed through the crowd, his face grim. He was a man who preferred his problems simple and his solutions final. He looked from Eleanor to the fire, and then his eyes settled on Tahan, his gaze hardening with suspicion. "What happened here?" "Eleanor," he asked, his voice a low rumble. "A fire," she gasped, her throat raw. "In the kitchen? And him?" The sheriff jerked his chin toward Tahan. "What is his part in this?" The question hung in the air, thick with insinuation. Tahan had not moved. He stood watching the fire, his face impassive, as if he had already forgotten her, as if he were a part of the landscape, as timeless and unreadable as the mountains behind him. Before Eleanor could answer, Martha Gable, a woman whose piety was matched only by her venomous tongue, spoke up from the crowd. "I saw him," she announced, her voice sharp enough to cut wire. "Saw him come out of her place, carrying her." A murmur went through the crowd. Eyes shifted. The meaning was clear. A white woman, a widow, being carried from her home in the middle of the night by a Navajo warrior. It was a story that wrote itself in the minds of people like Martha Gable, a story of sin and transgression, far more interesting than a simple kitchen fire. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. She saw the looks, the tight-lipped judgment, the quick, knowing glances exchanged between neighbors. They were not seeing a woman who had just lost everything. They were seeing a woman who had broken the rules. The line had been crossed. "He saved me," Eleanor said, her voice raspy but firm. She looked at the sheriff, then let her gaze sweep over the faces in the crowd. The smoke. I could not breathe. I was trapped. He broke down the door and carried me out. If not for him, I would be in there still. Her words fell into a well of hostile silence. No one met her eye. They looked at Tahan, their expressions a mixture of fear and contempt. He was the savage, the outsider. His heroism was an inconvenient fact that complicated their simple, brutal arithmetic of the world. It was easier to imagine him as the cause of the fire, not the solution. Sheriff Miller chewed on the inside of his cheek. He was a man who understood the town's temper. "All right," he said slowly, his eyes still fixed on Tahan. "You can go." It was not a thank you. It was a dismissal, an order. Tahan did not acknowledge the sheriff. His dark eyes met Eleanor's for a brief, unreadable moment. There was no warmth in them, no expectation of gratitude. There was only a profound and weary emptiness, the look of a man who had seen the worst of the world and expected nothing more. Then he turned and melted back into the darkness from which he had come, as silent and sudden as his arrival. The fire burned itself out, leaving a black, skeletal ruin against the first pale light of dawn. The townspeople drifted away, their duty as spectators done, leaving Eleanor alone with the ashes of her life. Someone had draped a rough wool blanket over her shoulders. She pulled it tighter, shivering as the sun began to warm the dusty street. She was alive. She owed her life to a man her husband had taught her to fear, a man her neighbors despised, and in their eyes, his act of salvation was her damnation. The debt was hers. But she knew, with a certainty that settled in her stomach like a cold stone, that the town would make them both pay for it. The smoke had cleared, but a new, more suffocating cloud was gathering, and she was standing right in the middle of it. The sun rose on a world of black bones and gray ash. Eleanor had spent what was left of the night in the small room behind Dr. Adams's office, a space that smelled of carbolic soap and old sorrows. Sleep had been a shallow, fleeting thing, haunted by the roar of flames and the feeling of being lifted into the night. She sat up on the narrow cot, the rough blanket scratching her skin. Her dress was smudged with soot, her hair a tangled mess, and her throat felt like she had swallowed hot sand. She walked back to her property as the town was beginning to stir. The early risers, the ones heading to the mines or the livery, gave her a wide berth. Their gazes were quick and furtive, a mix of pity and accusation. They saw the ruin of her eatery, but they also saw the woman who had been carried from it by a Navajo. The two facts were now inseparable, fused together in the crucible of last night's fire. The charred timbers of the building stood stark against the soft pink of the dawn sky, a monument to her loss. The smell of wet, burnt wood was the smell of a fresh grave. She walked the perimeter, her heart a dull, aching weight in her chest. Everything was gone. The tables her husband had built, the counter she had scrubbed 1,000 times, the small collection of books she kept in her living quarters in the back. All of it was now just ash. She stopped at the front. The entrance was a gaping black mouth. The door itself, the one Tahan had shattered to get to her, was a pile of splintered planks. Except it was not. In the dim morning light, she saw that something new stood in its place. It was not a door, not a proper one, but a sturdy barrier had been erected, closing the opening. It was made of several wide, weathered planks of wood, lashed together with strips of rawhide and secured to the scorched frame. The wood was not the milled pine from the town's lumberyard. It was cottonwood, silvered by the sun and wind, scavenged from the dry creek bed. And the nails, driven deep to hold the crosspieces, were not factory-made. They were thick and square-headed, hammered into shape by hand. Eleanor reached out and touched the rough wood. It was solid. It was a shield. It was an act of quiet, unasked for kindness in the wake of so much ruin and judgment. A door should be a door, not a hole. She could almost hear the thought behind the work. She knew, with absolute certainty, who had built it. While the town slept and dreamt its suspicious dreams, Tahan had been here, working in the dark, closing the wound in her home. A resolve hardened within her. Gratitude was a debt, and she had been raised to pay her debts. The town could whisper and stare. They could cast her out entirely for all she cared. She would not let this act pass unacknowledged. She would not hide behind propriety and fear while the only person who had helped her was condemned for it. She went to the mercantile, her chin held high. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, busied himself arranging tins on a shelf as she entered, his back to her. She waited, Finally. With a sigh, he turned. His face was a mask of strained neutrality. She bought coffee, sugar, and flour, paying with a few coins she had managed to grab from her coin box before fleeing the fire. She ignored the way his eyes refused to meet hers, the way he placed the change on the counter instead of into her hand, in the kitchen of the doctor's house, which his wife offered with reluctant charity. Eleanor baked a small, simple cake with cinnamon and molasses. She wrapped it in a clean cloth and poured the fresh, hot coffee into a tin flask. Then she started walking. She walked past the ruins of her life, past the saloon where men were already gathered, past the church with its judgmental steeple. She walked to the edge of town and kept going, following the dusty track that led toward the red mountains. The sun was higher now, beating down with an intensity that promised a blistering day. The town fell away behind her, and the vast, silent expanse of the desert opened up. The only sounds were the crunch of her boots on the gravel and the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her back, but when she glanced around, there was no one. The judgment was in the air itself, in the unforgiving glare of the sun. The Navajo camp was not much, a collection of 4 or 5 brush arbors and lean-tos clustered in the sparse shade of a few mesquite trees. A small fire smoldered in a ring of stones, sending a thin plume of juniper-scented smoke into the blue sky. An old woman sat weaving a blanket, her fingers moving with a slow, practiced grace. A few children stopped their play to stare at Eleanor with wide, dark eyes. They were silent, their faces unreadable. She saw Tahan near the base of a rock outcropping. He was mending a leather bridle, his long fingers working a needle and sinew with methodical precision. He wore buckskin trousers and no shirt, his back and shoulders a landscape of smooth, sun-darkened skin and lean muscle. An old, jagged scar ran across his left shoulder blade, a pale white line against the brown of his skin. He did not look up as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her every step. The silence in the camp was absolute, a waiting, watching stillness. She stopped a few feet from him. He continued his work, his focus entirely on the task at hand. Finally, she spoke, her voice sounding loud and foreign in the quiet. "I brought you something," she said. He finished pulling a stitch tight before he slowly raised his head. His eyes met hers. They were just as she remembered them from the night before, dark and deep and giving away nothing. He looked at the bundle in her hands, then back at her face. "Why?" he asked. His voice was a low rasp, as if he did not use it often. "For the door," she said, feeling suddenly awkward. "And for last night. You saved my life." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a denial. He set the bridle aside and rose to his feet. He was taller than she remembered, his presence commanding. He stood before her, waiting. She held out the flask and the wrapped cake. "It is coffee," she said, "and a cake." "It is not much." He took them from her. His fingers brushed against hers for a fleeting second, his skin calloused and warm. He unwrapped the cake and looked at it, then broke off a small piece and ate it. He chewed slowly, his expression unchanging. Then he drank from the flask of coffee. He looked off toward the mountains, a distant, haunted look entering his eyes. "The army teaches you to fix things with what you have," he said, his voice quiet, "and to pull people from fires." The words were unexpected, a small crack in his stoic facade. The army. The rumors were true. Then, she looked at him, seeing not just the silent Navajo warrior, but a man with a past that was as scarred as his back, a past that connected him, however briefly, to the world of her dead husband, the world of blue uniforms and sharp commands. "They betrayed you," she stated. It was not a question. It was something she read in the profound loneliness that surrounded him like a shroud. He looked at her, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He said nothing. He did not need to. His silence was its own confirmation. "I am sorry," she said, and she meant it. Sorry for the fire, for the town, for the army, for a world that had left him with nothing. He simply nodded again, then wrapped the cake back in its cloth and set it down with the flask. He picked up his bridle and his needle. The conversation was over. She had paid her debt. She turned and walked away, the silence of the camp following her back to the dusty track. The walk back was worse. The sun was high and hot. Her act of defiance had been seen, noted, and judged. She knew this before she even reached the first building of Dry Creek. Martha Gable was waiting for her. Her arms crossed over her ample chest, her face a thundercloud of righteous indignation. "So," Martha said, her voice dripping with contempt, "the grieving widow has found new company. I suppose we should not be surprised. Some women have no shame." Eleanor stopped. She looked at the woman who had once offered her condolences in casseroles. Now, all she saw was ugly, curdled piety. "I went to thank the man who saved my life," Eleanor said, her voice low and steady. "It is a courtesy you might not understand." "A courtesy?" Martha scoffed. "Going alone into a savage camp. We all know what kind of courtesy that is. You are a disgrace to your husband's memory." Eleanor felt a flash of hot anger, but she held it in check. "My husband is dead," she said, her words clipped and sharp, "and my eatery is a pile of ash. I believe I have earned the right to choose who I thank." She stepped around the woman and continued walking, not looking back. The word savage echoed in her ears. Later that afternoon, a new man rode into town. He was not a prospector or a rancher. He rode a fine black horse, and his clothes, though dusty from the trail, were well made. He wore a holstered pistol high on his hip and a silver star pinned to his vest. He moved with an easy confidence, his eyes taking in everything, missing nothing. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office and introduced himself. His name was Deke Saunders, a United States Marshal, sent from the territorial capital to investigate the fire at the Monroe Eatery. The news spread through town like a prairie fire. A federal lawman. It gave the event a new weight, a new importance. Sheriff Miller, flustered and out of his depth, escorted the marshal to the site of the fire. Eleanor watched from the shade of the mercantile's porch as Saunders walked through the wreckage, his sharp eyes examining the charred wood, the melted glass. Then he saw her and walked over, removing his hat. His hair was sandy blonde, his eyes a pale, chilly blue. His smile was smooth and practiced. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, his voice a pleasant baritone. "Marshal Deke Saunders, I am terribly sorry for your loss. This is a great tragedy." "Thank you, Marshal," she said, wary of his polished charm. "I will need to ask you some questions." "Of course," he continued, his smile never wavering. "About the fire, and about the property itself. I understand your late husband purchased this land outright. He held the title and all mineral rights." The question was odd. Why would a marshal investigating a fire care about mineral rights? "Yes," she answered slowly. "That is correct." "Interesting," Saunders murmured, his gaze drifting past the ruin of her eatery to the dry, rocky creek bed and the hills behind it. "Very interesting." He looked back at her, his eyes lingering a moment too long. "Do not you worry, Mrs. Monroe. I intend to get to the bottom of this. We will find out exactly what happened here, and why." As he walked away, a feeling of deep unease settled over Eleanor. The town's scorn was a blunt, ugly thing, but the marshal's polite interest felt far more dangerous. It was a cold, calculating curiosity that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with the dirt beneath her feet. She stood alone, caught between the open hostility of her neighbors and the hidden greed of the law. The repaired door, once a symbol of an unlikely human connection, now seemed like a fragile barrier against a gathering storm, and she was standing right in its path. The days that followed settled into a new and bitter routine. Eleanor's world had shrunk to the size of a leper's bell. People saw her coming and turned away. When she entered the mercantile, conversations would cease, replaced by a thick, disapproving silence. The women of the town, who had once been her society, now looked through her as if she were a pane of dusty glass. Martha Gable, having found her cause, fanned the flames of rumor at every opportunity. The story of the fire was no longer a tragedy. It was a sordid tale, whispered over sewing circles and laundry tubs. The Navajo, Tahan, was not a hero, but a dark accomplice. And Eleanor was no longer a respectable widow, but a fallen woman who had brought shame upon her husband's good name. She tried to work, to bring some order to the chaos of the ruin. Her living quarters at the back had been damaged, but not destroyed. The roof had partially caved in, and the walls were blackened with soot. Each morning she would go to the site, sifting through the debris, trying to salvage anything of value: a scorched iron pot, a handful of spoons, tarnished but whole, a porcelain doll from her childhood, its face cracked and blackened, a grotesque survivor. The work was backbreaking and heartbreaking in equal measure. Each salvaged item was a ghost of the life she had lost. One morning, after a night of fitful sleep, she noticed a change. A section of the collapsed roof over her bedroom had been propped up with sturdy cottonwood poles. A length of old canvas, likely from a discarded wagon cover, had been stretched across the largest hole, secured with rawhide ties. It was a rough, makeshift repair, but it was enough to keep the worst of the sun and the eventual rain out. Her heart skipped a beat. She looked around, but the street was empty save for a stray dog sniffing at the ashes. Later that day, she found that the handle of her well pump, which had been bent and jammed by a falling beam, was now straight and moved freely. A small, carefully carved wooden wedge held it firmly in place. She knew who was responsible. He came in the deep hours of the night, a silent phantom moving through the wreckage of her life, mending what he could. He fixed things with what he had, as he had told her. Each small repair was a quiet act of defiance against the town's verdict, a testament to a decency they refused to see. She felt a profound and complicated gratitude, an emotion that warmed her even as it isolated her further. She was tied to this man, this outcast, by a debt she could never repay in any way the world would deem proper. Marshal Deke Saunders, however, was very interested in what was proper. He spent his days interviewing the townsfolk, his notebook always open, his expression one of sober concern. But Eleanor noticed that his questions often strayed from the fire. He asked about the creek, how often it ran. He asked about the old prospector's tales of color in the hills behind her property. He was a man mapping a territory, not solving a crime. He finally summoned her for a formal interview in the sheriff's small, stuffy office. Sheriff Miller sat in a corner, looking uncomfortable and superfluous, while Saunders took the main chair behind the desk, as if it were his own. He smiled at Eleanor, a predator's calm, patient smile. "Mrs. Monroe," he began, his voice smooth as polished wood. "I need to clarify a few points from my report. You maintained that the fire was an accident, a grease fire in the kitchen." "It was," she said, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "And this Navajo, Tahan?" "He just happened to be passing by at the precise moment he was needed." "I do not know if he was passing by. I only know he was there. He saved me." Saunders made a small note. "And then you felt it necessary to visit his camp the very next day, alone." "I went to thank him." "A noble gesture," Saunders said, his pale blue eyes glinting. "But a reckless one. You are a woman alone, Mrs. Monroe. Such a visit could be misinterpreted, especially given the circumstances. It creates a perception of an unusual closeness." Eleanor stiffened. "My gratitude is not a matter for perception. Marshal, it is a matter of fact. I would be dead if not for him." "Perhaps," Saunders conceded, leaning forward slightly. "But the law is also a matter of perception. Territorial law, to be precise. Land grants, especially those given to military families, come with certain behavioral covenants, maintaining good standing in the community. For one, avoiding entanglements that could be seen as inciting unrest. Associating so publicly with a man considered a vagrant, even a hostile by some, could be construed as such an entanglement. The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare on the dusty desk between them. Her land. He was threatening her land. "Are you saying you will take my property because I thank the man who saved my life?" she asked, her voice trembling with a quiet rage. "I am saying that a fire of suspicious origin, followed by improper relations with a native of questionable character, creates a very complicated picture, Mrs. Monroe. A picture that might lead the territorial authorities to believe this land would be better managed in other hands. My hands are tied. You understand, I must simply report the facts as I see them." He leaned back, his smile returning. Satisfied, the interview was over. She walked out of the office, the hot sun blinding her. The air felt thick, impossible to breathe. The injustice of it was a physical weight, pressing down on her, crushing her. She had lost her husband, her home, her place in the community. And now this smiling, cold-eyed man was going to take the very ground from under her feet, all under the guise of the law. She did not go back to the doctor's house. She walked to the ruin. Her ruin. It was the only place that felt real. She stood in the center of what had been her dining room and looked at the devastation, the propped-up roof, the mended pump. Tahan's small kindnesses seemed like futile gestures against the tidal wave of greed and prejudice that was about to sweep her away. She saw a heavy, charred beam half buried in the ash. A sudden, desperate need to do something, to fight back in some small way, seized her. She grabbed one end of the beam and pulled. It was immensely heavy, immovable. She pulled again, her muscles straining, a raw grunt escaping her lips. It did not budge. The futility of it, the absolute, crushing hopelessness of her situation, broke over her. Her strength gave out, not just in her arms, but in her soul. She sank to her knees in the ash, and the tears she had held back for days finally came. They were not the quiet, dignified tears of a widow. They were harsh, ragged sobs that tore from her throat, the sound of a heart breaking. She wept for her lost husband, for her burned home, for her own foolish pride, for a world so cruel and unjust. She cried until she had nothing left, until she was just a hollow, trembling thing kneeling in the ruins. She did not know how long he had been there. When her sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, she became aware of a presence. She looked up. Tahan was standing a few yards away, near the shattered door frame, his face as impassive as stone. He was just watching her, his dark eyes holding a stillness that was not pity, but a deep, shared understanding of loss. He did not speak. He did not move to comfort her. He simply stood his ground, a silent witness to her despair. And his presence was more comforting than any words could have been. She wiped her face with the back of her sooty hand, leaving a black streak across her cheek. She felt a flush of shame, but it was quickly replaced by a weary resignation. He had seen her at her most vulnerable. "Did you fix my roof?" she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. The question was absurd, a grasp for normalcy in the midst of chaos. He considered it for a moment, his expression unchanging. "No," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The wind fixed it. I just showed it the way." A small, watery laugh escaped her. It was a strange, broken sound, but it was real. For the first time in days, the crushing weight on her chest lifted, just for a second. He held her gaze, and in that moment, she saw past the stoic warrior. She saw the ghost of a man who might have understood humor, who might have even known how to smile once, a long time ago. The moment was broken by a crash of drunken laughter from the direction of the saloon. Night had fallen without her noticing. A group of 3 cowboys stumbled out into the street, their forms loud and unsteady in the moonlight. They saw Tahan standing in the shadows, and their laughter turned mean. "Well, look what we have here," one of them slurred. A big man with a florid face, the widow's pet savage. Tahan did not move, but Eleanor saw his body tense, a subtle shift from stillness to readiness. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. The big cowboy turned his attention to her. "You best get inside, little lady," he sneered. "This ain't your business. This here redskin needs to be taught a lesson about sniffing around white women's property." He took a step toward Tahan, his friends fanning out beside him. Eleanor's mind raced. They were drunk and stupid and spoiling for a fight. Tahan might be able to handle one or two of them, but three was too many. The sheriff was at the other end of town, and no one else would help. Her eyes darted around the ruin, searching for something, anything. Her gaze fell on a heavy, cast-iron skillet, half buried in the ash near the kitchen doorway. Without a second thought, she lunged for it, her fingers closing around the handle. It was heavy, solid. She turned, her heart pounding against her ribs, and stepped out of the shadows, placing herself between Tahan and the cowboys. She held the skillet like a weapon, its black surface catching the faint moonlight. "I said, leave him alone," she repeated, her voice low and shaking, but with an edge of pure, cold fury. The cowboys stopped, surprised. The sight of the soot-stained widow, wild-eyed and brandishing a frying pan, was so unexpected that it momentarily sobered them. They looked at each other, then back at her. The big man chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "She is a feisty one, ain't she?" he said to his friends. He took another step forward, his hand reaching for her. In that instant, Tahan moved. He was not a phantom anymore. He was a blur of contained violence. He stepped in front of Eleanor, pushing her behind him, his body a shield. His hand shot out and seized the cowboy's outstretched wrist. The cowboy grunted in pain, his eyes wide with shock at the speed and strength of the grip. The standoff hung in the air, taut and dangerous. The night was silent save for the ragged breathing of the men. From the darkness of the ruin behind them, a low flicker of orange caught Eleanor's eye. A stray ember from the fire pit, fanned by the evening breeze, had ignited a piece of dry wood. The small flame danced, casting flickering shadows on the tense faces in the street. In that unsteady, primal light, Eleanor's eyes met Tahan's over his shoulder. All pretense was gone. There was no widow, no savage, no white, no Navajo. There was only a man and a woman, standing back to back against a hostile world. She saw in his eyes a fierce, protective instinct, a spark of something that went deeper than gratitude or pity. He saw in hers not fear, but a raw, unexpected courage, a willingness to stand for him when no one else would. It was a silent, elemental pact, forged in ash and sealed by firelight. The cowboys, sensing a shift in the balance, a danger they did not understand, slowly backed away. Tahan released the man's wrist, and the three of them shuffled off into the darkness, muttering curses. He stood for a long moment, his back still to her, watching them go. Then he turned. He looked at her, at the skillet still clutched in her hand, at the streak of soot on her face. He gave a single solemn nod. It was not thanks. It was an acknowledgement, a sign of respect. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he was gone, disappearing into the vast, dark desert that was his only true home. Eleanor stood alone in the ruin, the heavy skillet in her hand, the small fire dancing beside her, its light keeping the shadows at bay. The air grew thick and heavy in the days following the confrontation. A suffocating stillness settled over Dry Creek, the kind that comes before a storm. The sky, usually a vast, indifferent blue, took on a bruised yellow-gray hue at the edges. Eleanor felt the change in her bones. She had moved into the one room at the back of her ruin that was now semi-habitable. The canvas patch on the roof was a flimsy shield against the sky, and the walls still smelled of smoke and damp. But it was hers. She worked from sunup to sundown, clearing rubble, her hands raw, her muscles screaming in protest. It was a penance and a reclamation, a way to build something, anything, in the face of absolute loss. The town continued its silent punishment. Her existence was an inconvenient truth they chose to ignore. Marshal Saunders watched her. His presence a constant, low-grade threat. He would stand across the street for long periods, simply observing her labor. His arms crossed, a thoughtful expression on his face that made her skin crawl. He was not a man in a hurry. He was a vulture, content to circle, waiting for her to collapse. She saw Tahan only from a distance, sometimes, at dawn. She would see a lone figure on the ridge of the buttes, a silhouette against the rising sun. She knew it was him. He was watching, a silent guardian she had never asked for, a complication she could not afford. Their alliance, forged in firelight and fury, was a dangerous secret that hummed in the oppressive air between them. The storm broke on the third night. It came not with a gentle prelude of rain, but with a sudden, violent assault. A furious wind swept down from the mountains, howling through the skeletal remains of the eatery, kicking up clouds of ash that stung her eyes. Then came the lightning, not in flickers, but in great, searing cracks that tore the sky in two, followed instantly by thunder that was not a rumble but a physical concussion. Shaking the very ground, Eleanor huddled in her small room, a single lantern casting a pathetic circle of light against the roaring darkness. Rain began to fall, a few heavy drops at first, then a deafening, solid sheet of water that hammered against the canvas roof. The wind shrieked, tearing at the edges of the patch. She could hear the rawhide ties straining, the wood of the support poles groaning in protest, fear, cold and sharp, coiled in her stomach. She was trapped in a flimsy box, at the mercy of a storm that seemed to have a personal malevolence. A loud crack echoed above the din, the sound of wood splintering. The main support pole Tahan had wedged into place buckled. With a great tearing sound, the canvas ripped away, and the storm was inside with her. Icy water and wind blasted into the room. Before she could scramble away, the rest of the weakened roof gave way. Heavy beams and chunks of sod collapsed inward. She cried out as a searing pain shot through her side, a heavy weight pinning her leg. Then darkness, dust, and the roar of the deluge consumed everything. Panic was a wild animal in her chest. She was trapped, the weight on her leg crushing, the rain pouring down on her. She struggled, but the beam was too heavy. The world was a terrifying chaos of noise and pain. Through the storm's fury, she thought she heard a shout. It was not the wind. It was a human voice. A moment later, he was there, a dark shape in the maelstrom, illuminated by a flash of lightning. Tahan. He moved with a focused urgency, ignoring the lashing rain. He assessed the collapse in an instant, his hands finding a leverage point on the beam. With a low grunt of exertion that was torn away by the wind, he heaved. The pressure on her leg lessened. She scrambled free, her body trembling, her side screaming in protest. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm, pulling her up. He shouted something, but the wind stole the words. He did not need them. His meaning was clear. He guided her out of the wreckage, half carrying her as they fought their way through the blinding curtain of rain. The street was a river of mud. The wind tore at them, trying to rip them apart. He shielded her with his body, his strength a solid anchor in the chaos. He led her away from the town, toward the rock outcroppings at the base of the buttes. There, tucked into a deep fissure in the rock, was a small, low shelter she had never seen before. It was a simple lean-to, built of scavenged wood and hide, but it was ingeniously placed, protected from the worst of the wind. He pushed aside a heavy flap of buffalo hide and guided her into the dark, dry space within. The sudden quiet was as shocking as the storm's noise. The roar was muffled to a distant drumming. The shelter was small, barely large enough for two people to sit. A small, smokeless fire burned in a hollowed-out stone, casting a warm, flickering glow on the rock walls. The air smelled of juniper and damp earth. Tahan let go of her arm. The adrenaline that had carried her through the last few minutes receded, and the pain crashed over her in a sickening wave. Her leg was bruised and scraped, but it was the agony in her ribs that stole her breath. Every inhalation was a sharp, stabbing punishment. She pressed a hand to her side, gasping. He saw her distress immediately. He knelt in front of her, his dark eyes narrowed with concern. He spoke a single word, a question in his own language. She shook her head, unable to speak, and tried to draw a breath. But something was constricting her, a rigid cage around her torso that turned every movement into torture. Her corset, the stays, made of steel and bone, were digging into her bruised ribs, squeezing the very air from her lungs. She had to get it off. Her fingers, numb and clumsy with cold and shock, fumbled with the laces at her back. The wet cotton was swollen and tight, the knots impossible. Panic began to rise again. She could not breathe. Tahan understood. He moved behind her, his presence filling the small space. She felt a moment of hesitation from him, a recognition of the boundary he was about to cross. Then his hands were on her back. They were rough, calloused, the hands of a man who lived by his strength, but his touch was unbelievably gentle. He did not fumble. His long fingers found the knotted laces and began to work them with a steady, patient precision. The intimacy of the act was staggering. He, a Navajo warrior, was unlacing the most private garment of a white woman, a captain's widow. The storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest inside her. She could feel the warmth of his breath on her neck, the solid presence of his body behind hers. Each touch of his fingers against the thin fabric of her chemise sent a jolt through her. This was not the impersonal touch of a doctor. It was something else entirely, something deeply human and terrifyingly personal. He worked in silence, his focus absolute. He loosened the top laces, giving her a small measure of relief, but the tightest part around her waist remained stubbornly constricted. He gathered the laces in one hand and pulled, applying steady pressure to break the knot's hold. There was a sudden, sharp snap. The sound was shockingly loud in the enclosed space, like a dry twig breaking. One of the steel stays in the corset, stressed by the pressure and her fall, had broken. In his hands, the cage had shattered. The corset snapped in his hands, and with it, so did the walls she had built so carefully around her heart. A great, shuddering breath filled her lungs. It was painful, but it was full and deep. The release was so profound it was almost a sob. The rigid armor that had defined her shape, her posture, her very existence as a proper woman, was broken, and she was free. He finished unlacing the garment and gently pulled it away from her. She slumped forward, leaning on her knees, breathing in the clean, dry air of the shelter. He moved back in front of her, his face a mask in the firelight. He held up a hand, a silent question, asking permission to check the injury. She was past all thought of propriety. She was a creature of pain and instinct, and this man was her only solace. She gave a weak nod. With infinite care, he pushed aside the damp fabric of her chemise. The firelight flickered over her skin, revealing a dark, ugly bruise already forming on her side. His touch was light, clinical, his fingers probing gently to feel for broken bones. For him, a man whose past was steeped in the violence between their peoples, this was a new territory. He was touching a white woman not with a weapon, not in anger or in servitude, but with a healer's gentle hand. The hatred he had been taught, the bitterness he had earned, seemed to fall away in that small, quiet space, leaving only a shared humanity. He seemed satisfied that nothing was broken. From a small leather pouch at his belt, he took a pinch of dried leaves, crushing them in his palm to release a sharp, medicinal scent. He mixed them with a few drops of water from a skin and gently applied the poultice to her scrapes and the worst of the bruise. His touch was a strange combination of roughness and tenderness, the calloused pads of his fingers surprisingly soft against her skin. When he was done, he sat back on his heels, He pulled the edges of her chemise back into place with a gesture of profound respect. The task was complete. He retreated to the other side of the small fire, wrapping a blanket around his own shoulders, giving her space. But the space between them was no longer empty. It was charged with the ghost of his touch, with the sound of her own ragged breathing, with the unspoken truth of what had just happened. The corset lay on the dirt floor, a broken, empty shell. Eleanor looked at it, then at the man across the fire. She was afraid, not of him, not of the storm. She was afraid of the feeling that was unfolding inside her, a feeling as powerful and untamable as the thunder outside. It was a terrifying gratitude that was turning into something more, something warmer and more dangerous. It was a connection to this silent, outcast man that felt more real than anything she had ever known with her own husband. Tahan stared into the fire, his profile carved from stone and shadow. He knew. He had to know. He was a man who survived by reading the subtlest signs, the shifting of the wind, the track of an animal. He could surely read the turmoil in her. He knew that this fragile trust, this moment of shared vulnerability, was a seed planted in poisonous soil. Any love between them was a love that was forbidden, a love that could get them both killed. The storm raged on, a wild symphony of wind and rain. But inside the shelter, a different storm had broken, a silent, internal tempest of fear and longing. They sat in the flickering firelight, two survivors on a tiny island in a world determined to drown them, bound by a broken piece of steel and a truth that neither of them dared to speak. The new day dawned on a world washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of impossible clarity and air that smelled of wet dust and creosote. In the small rock shelter, the fire had burned down to a pile of glowing embers. Eleanor awoke from a shallow, unrestful sleep to find Tahan gone. A water skin and a piece of dried meat had been left near her, a silent provision. The broken corset lay where it had fallen, a strange and intimate relic in the dirt. She dressed, her movement stiff and painful, her bruised ribs a constant, sharp reminder of the night's chaos and the quiet tenderness that had followed. She knew she could not stay. To remain would be to accept a reality she was not ready for, to cross a line from which there was no return. She had to go back to the ruin, to the shell of her life in Dry Creek. She tucked the broken corset into a small bundle, an act she did not herself understand, and stepped out into the bright, clean morning. He was waiting for her, a stone's throw from the shelter, his back to her as he scanned the horizon. He turned as she approached, his face giving no indication of the intimacy they had shared. He simply nodded toward the town and began to walk, and she followed a few paces behind. He did not escort her all the way back. At the edge of the desert where the town began, he stopped. He gave her one long, unreadable look, and then he was gone, melting into the landscape of rock and scrub. Eleanor walked back into Dry Creek feeling like a stranger. The town was assessing the storm's damage, but the real storm, the one that had broken inside her, was a secret she carried in the ache of her ribs and the memory of a gentle hand in the dark. She spent the next few days in a haze of grueling labor. She had to reinforce the shelter at the back of the ruin, creating a more permanent, if crude, home for herself. The town's shunning was now absolute. Even Mr. Henderson at the Mercantile served her in stony silence. His disapproval a palpable force. It did not matter. Her focus had narrowed to the simple, brutal calculus of survival. One afternoon, driven by a need for different materials to patch her roof, she walked along the Dry Creek bed, away from the town, in the direction of Tahan's camp. She had no intention of seeing him. She was merely foraging, but as she rounded a bend, she saw something that made her stop. Footprints in the damp sand. Tahan's moccasins. She recognized the print, but there were other tracks too. Heavier boot prints. Two men. They were scuffed, as if the men had been trying to hide their passage. A cold prickle of unease ran down her spine. Curiosity, or perhaps a premonition, made her follow the tracks. They led up a narrow game trail that wound into the rocky hills, a path she knew Tahan sometimes used as a shortcut. She moved cautiously, her eyes scanning the ground. Then she saw it, a thin length of sinew, stretched taut across the path at ankle height, nearly invisible against the dirt. It was tied to a precariously balanced pile of heavy rocks on the ledge just above the trail. It was a deadfall trap, crude, but deadly. It had been set for Tahan. Her blood ran cold. This was not the work of drunken cowboys. This was a calculated attempt to kill him. She looked closer and saw where the boot prints led away, down a different path back toward the town. She carefully backed away from the trap, her heart hammering. Someone wanted Tahan dead, and they had tried to make it look like an accident. She scrambled back to her ruin, her mind racing. Who would do this? The answer came with a sickening certainty. Marshal Deke Saunders. It had to be. But why? Why go to such lengths to eliminate a lone Navajo? Back in her shelter, she began to tear through the last of her husband's belongings she had salvaged. A small, water-damaged trunk of papers. She had not had the heart to look through them before. Now, she was driven by a desperate need for an answer. She sifted through old military orders, receipts, letters from his family back east. And then she found it. It was a rolled-up piece of canvas, tucked inside a leather tube. She unrolled it on the floor. It was a map, hand-drawn but detailed. It showed her property, the eatery, the creek bed, and the hills behind it. And in those hills, precisely under the plot of land her eatery stood on, was a small, shaded area marked with a cross. Next to it, in her husband's neat hand, were the words, "Assay confirms high-grade gold quartz vein." Samuel had known. He had not bought this worthless piece of desert on a whim. He had bought a gold mine. Everything clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. The fire was no accident. It was arson, a deliberate act to scare her off, to make her abandon the land. Saunders' questions about mineral rights, his veiled threats, his presence in Dry Creek. He was not here to investigate a fire. He was here to claim the gold, and Tahan, the silent man who kept helping her, who kept giving her the strength to stay, was the one obstacle in his path. If Tahan was gone, she would be completely alone, unprotected, an easy target to be frightened away or disposed of. The trap on the trail was not just murder. It was a business transaction. The knowledge was a cold, terrifying weight. She was not just fighting the town's prejudice anymore. She was fighting a ruthless, powerful man who had the law on his side and murder in his heart. To stay in Dry Creek was to die. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but Saunders would not give up, and he would continue to come after Tahan. She had to warn him. She had to run. She waited until the moon was high and the town was asleep. She packed a small bag with the last of her food, the water skin, and the map, which she tucked deep inside her dress. She slipped out of the ruin and into the silent streets, a ghost leaving a graveyard. She did not look back. There was nothing left for her there. The walk to his camp was filled with a new kind of terror. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. When she finally saw the faint glow of his small fire, she nearly wept with relief. He was sitting by the flames, sharpening the head of a spear, his movements economical and precise. He looked up as she stepped into the firelight, his eyes questioning, his hand never leaving the spear. "They set a trap for you," she said, her voice a breathless rush. "On the trail, a deadfall. I saw the tracks. It was Saunders' men." He showed no surprise, only a slight narrowing of his eyes. He had known he was in danger. "He has been after my land," she continued, pulling out the map and unrolling it in the flickering light. "There is gold. Tahan, a lot of it, the fire, all of it, was to get me to leave. He will not stop. He will kill you to get to me, and then he will kill me. We have to go." He looked at the map, his gaze lingering on the cross her husband had drawn. He looked at her, at the fear and desperate resolve in her eyes. He knew she was right. He had seen the greed in the marshal's eyes. had felt the man's hatred like a physical force. Dry Creek was a cage, and the door was closing. He nodded slowly. He stood and, in a few swift movements, extinguished the fire and gathered his meager possessions: a blanket, a knife, a bow, and a quiver of arrows. He was a man accustomed to leaving everything behind. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice small. "Into the mountains," he said, "my people's land. He will not follow us there." They moved out under the cover of darkness, two fugitives leaving a world that had no place for them. Tahan took the lead, setting a hard, steady pace. He moved with a silent, ghostly grace, his feet seeming to find purchase on the most treacherous ground. Eleanor struggled to keep up, her lungs burning, her bruised side aching with every step. The landscape was brutal and unforgiving, a maze of sharp rocks and thorny brush. The first few days were a blur of exhaustion and fear. They traveled mostly at night, resting during the hottest part of the day in the shade of rock overhangs. Tahan was a patient teacher. He showed her how to walk so as to leave the faintest trail, how to find water by digging in the sand of a dry wash, which plants were safe to eat and which would kill her. She learned to be silent, to listen to the whisper of the wind, to read the stories told by a broken twig or a disturbed stone. The pampered captain's wife was stripped away, layer by layer, by the harsh beauty of the desert, leaving behind a tougher, more resilient core. Their survival depended on a complete and fragile trust. He trusted her to keep pace, to not complain, to learn. She trusted him with her life, following him without question into a wilderness that would have killed her in a day on her own. The barriers of race and language and experience crumbled into dust. They were no longer white and Navajo. They were simply a man and a woman, bound together against a hostile world. They spoke little, but their silence was not empty. It was filled with a growing awareness of each other. She watched his hands as he skillfully fletched an arrow or skinned a rabbit for their meal. She saw the lines of sorrow etched around his eyes when he thought she was not looking. He, in turn, saw the iron will beneath her fear, the uncomplaining strength she brought to each grueling day. One evening, as they sat by a tiny, smokeless fire tucked deep in a hidden canyon, she tended to a long gash on his forearm, a wound from a slip on a shale slope. She cleaned it with water from her canteen and wrapped it with a strip of cloth torn from her petticoat. Her touch was gentle, her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched her, his face unreadable in the firelight. The roles were reversed. Now she was the healer, her small act of care a mirror of his own in the rock shelter. After she had finished, she looked up and found him watching her, his gaze so intense it was like a physical touch. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was the first time he had ever used her name. It sounded strange and beautiful in the vast silence of the canyon. In that moment, she understood the truth of her own heart. This journey was not just a flight for survival. It was a journey toward him. She looked out at the tracks they had made in the sandy floor of the canyon. She knew that by morning, the wind would have erased them completely, leaving no trace that they had ever passed by. Their connection, their fragile, growing love, was like that a temporary imprint on a vast and unforgiving landscape, beautiful and precious and utterly doomed to be swept away. But for now, here in this hidden place, they were free, and that was enough. They traveled deeper into the heart of the mountains, into a land of towering rock spires and canyons so deep the sun reached their floors for only an hour a day. This was the Deneta, the sacred homeland of Tahan's people. The air was different here, thinner and cleaner, filled with the scent of pine and the profound silence of ages. The ghosts of Dry Creek, the sneering face of Marshall Saunders, the whispers and judgments, all began to feel like a bad dream from another lifetime. Here, there were no invisible lines drawn in the dust. The only laws were the ancient, unforgiving ones of survival. They found shelter in a shallow cave carved into the side of a sheer sandstone cliff. a place Eleanor could have never reached without Tahan's guidance. The entrance was a narrow slit, easily missed, but it opened into a surprisingly large chamber, protected from the wind and sun. The walls were covered in pictographs, faded red and yellow figures of men and animals dancing across the rock, telling stories of hunts and ceremonies from a time beyond memory. It felt like a holy place, a sanctuary. For days, this cave was their world. They fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and their own needs. Tahan would leave at dawn, a silent shadow moving through the canyons, returning with a rabbit or a brace of quail. Eleanor would tend the small, smokeless fire, gather edible roots and berries from the sparse vegetation, and mend their worn clothing. They were a self-contained unit, a tribe of two. The harshness of their existence stripped away everything that was not essential, and in that stripping away, a deep and quiet intimacy grew. One evening, as the last light painted the canyon walls in shades of rose and violet, they sat by the fire, sharing a meal of roasted quail. The silence between them was comfortable, companionable. Eleanor watched the firelight play across his strong, somber features. She had come to know the landscape of his face, as well as the canyons around them, the hard line of his jaw, the faint scars that told stories of forgotten battles, the deep-set eyes that held a universe of sorrow. "Did you grow up here?" she asked softly, the question a small stone dropped into a deep well. He was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. When he spoke, his voice was low, laced with a pain that was as old as the mountains. "Not here. In a valley to the south, near the Little Colorado. It was a good place. The winters were not so cold. My family had sheep." He paused, and she knew not to press him. She waited, listening to the crackle of the fire. "I had a wife," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Her name was Hastian. It means sunlight on the water, and a son, a little boy." He had his mother's laugh. They were my sun and my moon, my whole sky. Eleanor's heart ached. She could see them in her mind's eye, a woman with a bright smile, a small boy with laughing eyes. She saw the life he had lost, a life of warmth and family, so different from the solitary, haunted existence he now led. "What happened?" she asked, her own voice barely audible. "The bluecoats," he said, and a bitter, cold anger entered his voice. "It was the winter of 71. They came and said our valley was now part of the reservation boundary, but on the wrong side, they drove us out. We had to leave our homes, our sheep. We walked for days in the snow, toward the reservation lands to the north, but they brought a sickness with them." He fell silent again, his jaw tight. He picked up a stick and drew a shape in the dirt. A spiral, the Navajo symbol for the journey of life. It was a quiet sickness, a ghost that stole the breath. It came into our camp in the night. First the old ones, then the children. My boy, he was so small. His fever burned for 3 days. Hastian held him until the end. She would not let him go. A week later, the ghost came for her. I buried them together, under a juniper tree. I buried my whole sky. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, hot and sharp. She reached out, her hand hovering over his arm before she drew it back. There were no words for a loss so absolute. But as the meaning of his story settled in her, a different feeling began to dawn. A cold dread that started in the pit of her stomach and spread through her veins like ice. The winter of 71, the Little Colorado Valley, a pacification campaign. The words echoed in her memory, words from her husband's letters. Samuel had been stationed at Fort Defiance that year. He had written to her with pride about his first command, a campaign to clear out the last of the renegade Navajo bands from the newly drawn reservation borders. A successful mission. He had called it, he had mentioned, in passing, some collateral sickness in the native camps, a regrettable but necessary consequence of bringing order to the territory. The world seemed to tilt and spin. The fire in front of her blurred. The man who had saved her life, the man she was coming to love with a desperate, hopeless intensity, and the man she had loved and buried were now bound together by the ghosts of a woman and a child, her husband. Captain Samuel Monroe had been the Blue-Coat commander. His orders, his success, had been the direct cause of Tahan's unspeakable tragedy. The canyon seemed to press in on her, its ancient voices whispering a terrible truth. She felt a wave of nausea, of complicity. She was the wife of the man who had destroyed his world. This chasm between them was not just one of race or culture. It was a river of blood, a river of tears, and her husband had been its source. She looked at Tahan, at the profound grief carved into his face, and she felt like a liar, a traitor. Before she could speak, before she could confess the terrible truth that was choking her, the world outside the cave exploded. A sudden, violent gust of wind screamed through the canyon, extinguishing their fire in a single, furious puff, plunging the cave into absolute darkness. A low, menacing rumble grew into a deafening roar. It was the sound of 1,000 horses galloping across the sky, a desert sandstorm. Tahan was on his feet in an instant, pulling her back, deeper into the cave. The wind at the cave's mouth was a solid, physical force, driving a scouring wave of sand and pebbles before it. The world was reduced to a roaring, scouring chaos. Tahan pressed her against the back wall, shielding her with his body as the storm raged. The noise was indescribable, the shriek of the wind and the hiss of the sand a symphony of destruction. Then came a new sound, a deep, groaning crack from the cliff face above them. The ground shuddered. With a deafening roar, a section of the cliff overhanging the entrance gave way. Tons of rock and sand cascaded down, sealing the narrow opening, burying them alive. The roar was replaced by a sudden, terrifying silence, broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing and the faint, muffled howl of the storm outside. They were trapped. The darkness was absolute, a thick, pressing blackness that was more than just the absence of light. It was the darkness of a tomb. Eleanor's breath hitched in a sob of pure terror. They had escaped Saunders only to be buried by the mountain. Tahan's hand found hers in the dark. His grip was strong, steady, an anchor in the terrifying void. He said nothing, but his touch spoke volumes. We are alive. We are together. Hours passed. The muffled sound of the storm slowly died away, leaving a silence that was even more profound. They were entombed. The air in the cave grew thick and stale. Death was no longer an abstract threat. It was a patient, waiting presence in the darkness with them. In the face of that certainty, all the barriers, all the secrets and sorrows, seemed to fall away. There was nothing left but the two of them, and the truth. "Tahan," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Her husband, my Samuel, he was the commander at Fort Defiance in the winter of '71. She felt him flinch in the darkness, a sharp, sudden intake of breath. The truth was out, a terrible, poisoned thing between them. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of it, the weight of ghosts and history and impossible, tragic fate. She expected him to pull his hand away. She expected hatred, revulsion, but he only tightened his grip, his fingers lacing through hers. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with a weary resignation, as if he were speaking of a destiny written in the stars long ago. "Our past is a river of blood between us," he said. "I know," she sobbed, the tears she could no longer hold back tracking through the dust on her face. But it was not a past of their making. They were just two people caught in the brutal, grinding gears of history, in the face of a slow, certain death. That shared history was all they had left. She did not think. She moved. She turned in the darkness and threw her arms around him, burying her face in the rough buckskin of his shirt. She clung to him with all the strength she had left, a desperate, final act of a woman with nothing left to lose. He was solid and warm in the cold, dead dark. He was life. He hesitated for only a heartbeat, and then his arms came around her, pulling her close. His embrace was not one of passion, but of a profound and sorrowful communion. It was the embrace of two survivors clinging to each other on the last patch of solid ground in a world that was sinking beneath their feet. "I am not drowning in it," she whispered against his chest, her voice fierce with a sudden, desperate clarity. "Not anymore. I am here, with you." He held her tighter, his face buried in her hair. He did not speak. He did not need to. In the darkness of their shared tomb, in the shadow of their impossible past and their non-existent future, they finally admitted the truth that had grown between them in the canyons and the firelight. It was a love born of tragedy and defiance, a love that could never have existed in the sunlit world, a love that had found its voice only at the edge of the grave. It was a confession, an ending, and in its own terrible, beautiful way, a salvation found at the heart of a tragedy. The storm outside was over, but the one within had finally broken. The darkness in the cave was a living thing, a heavy blanket that muffled sound and erased the world, but it was no longer a tomb. In their shared confession, in the simple, profound act of holding each other against the end, Eleanor and Tahan had found a flicker of light. They sat together, his arm still around her head resting on his shoulder. The impossible, tragic truth of their pasts hung between them, not as a barrier, but as a shared scar. The world had done its worst to them, had conspired with fate and history to keep them apart, and in doing so, had forged a bond that nothing else could break. How long they sat in the silent dark, she did not know. Time had ceased to have meaning. There was only the steady rise and fall of his chest, the solid warmth of his body against hers, and the grim certainty of their fate. The air was growing thin, each breath a conscious effort. "We cannot stay here." Tahan's voice was a low rumble, close to her ear. "We will drink the air until it is gone." "Is there a way out?" she asked, her voice devoid of hope. The rockfall had sounded so final. "There is always a way," he said. "The mountain breathes. We must find its mouth." He released her, and the loss of his touch was immediate and absolute, plunging her back into a cold, terrifying isolation. She heard him moving in the pitch blackness, the soft scuff of his moccasins on the stone floor. He was a creature of this dark, primal world, his senses tuned to things she could not perceive. She heard him running his hands along the cave walls, feeling the texture of the rock, searching. "I need a flame," he said, "just for a moment." She remembered the small tinder box she always carried, a habit from years of lighting the eatery's stoves. Her fingers, stiff and clumsy, fumbled in the pocket of her dress. She found it, along with a small stub of a candle. She struck a match. The sudden flare of light was blinding, a painful shock after the long hours of blackness. In the brief, flickering light, she saw the cave clearly for the first time. The entrance was completely blocked by a solid wall of rock and sand, but Tahan was not looking there. His gaze was fixed on the ceiling. He pointed. "There," he said. She followed his gaze. High up on the back wall, almost at the ceiling, was a narrow, dark fissure, a crack in the mountain's stone skin. A faint, almost imperceptible movement of dust motes danced in the candlelight near the opening. The mountain was breathing. The match went out, plunging them back into darkness. But now it was a darkness with a purpose. He described the path to her, his voice a calm, steady presence. He would climb first, using the ancient handholds carved into the rock by the ones who had made this place a home. She would have to follow. The climb was a nightmare. The handholds were small and worn smooth with time. Her bruised ribs screamed with every upward pull. More than once, her foot slipped on the smooth stone, her life held only by the strength of her grip. But always, Tahan's voice would come from the darkness above her, calm and encouraging, guiding her hand to the next hold, telling her where to place her foot. He was her eyes, her strength. Finally, her hand reached the top, and he was there, his strong grip closing around her wrist, pulling her the last few feet into the narrow fissure. They crawled on their hands and knees through a tight, winding passage, the rock scraping their skin. The air grew fresher, cooler, and then, ahead, she saw it. A faint, gray light. They emerged, blinking and gasping, into the afternoon sun. They were on a high, narrow ledge, far above the canyon floor. They were bruised, exhausted, and filthy, but they were alive. The world was spread out below them, a breathtaking vista of red rock and blue sky. For a moment, they simply stood there, breathing in the clean, free air. They had been to the edge of the grave and had returned. Eleanor looked at Tahan. His face was streaked with dirt, his expression weary, but his eyes, when they met hers, held a new light. The shadows of the past were still there, but they no longer dominated. He reached out and gently brushed a smudge of dirt from her cheek. It was a simple, tender gesture that spoke more than words ever could. In this wild, free place, they were not the labels the world had given them. They were just Eleanor and Tahan. The moment of peace was shattered by a sound that did not belong in this ancient landscape. The sharp, metallic click of a rifle being cocked. "Well now," said a familiar, chillingly pleasant voice. "Look what the mountain coughed up." They turned. Standing on the trail not 20 yards below their ledge were Marshal Deke Saunders and 2 other men, their faces hard and grim, rifles held at the ready. Saunders was smiling, that same cold, predatory smile. He had found them. He must have hired a tracker, someone who knew these mountains nearly as well as Tahan. "You have led me on quite a chase, Mrs. Monroe," Saunders said, his voice echoing in the canyon. "But all good things must come to an end. I am here to reclaim what is mine, and to arrest this fugitive for abduction and horse theft." He added the last part with a contemptuous wave toward Tahan. "He is not a fugitive," Eleanor said, her voice shaking but defiant. "We fled because you tried to murder him. You set a trap." Saunders chuckled. "An unfortunate misunderstanding with some local hunters. I am sure. Now, be a good girl and come on down. We can settle all this legally. My claim to that land is perfectly in order." A lie, she thought, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. Her husband's papers, the deed, it was all in order. Saunders had no legal claim. His entire strategy was based on intimidation and forgery. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength she did not know she possessed. "Your claim is a fraud, and I have the proof." Saunders's smile vanished. His eyes turned to chips of ice. He raised his rifle. The black hole of the barrel pointed directly at her. "I was hoping to avoid this," he said, his voice flat and deadly. "But you have become a tiresome complication." Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Eleanor saw the tightening of his finger on the trigger, the small, final movement that would end her life. And then Tahan moved. He did not hesitate. He did not think. He reacted with a pure, selfless instinct. He threw himself in front of her, his body a shield, just as the rifle cracked. The sound was a flat, ugly slap against the canyon walls. Tahan grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain. He staggered back, a dark, blossoming stain spreading across the front of his buckskin shirt. High on his chest, his eyes wide with shock and pain, met hers for a heart-stopping second. Then his knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the rocky ledge. "No!" The word was a raw, primal scream torn from Eleanor's soul. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over the terrible wound, not knowing what to do. Blood, dark and frighteningly real, pumped from between his fingers where he clutched at his chest. The sight of him, fallen and bleeding because of her, for her, burned away the last vestiges of her fear. It was cauterized in a blaze of pure, incandescent rage. She looked down at Saunders, her eyes no longer filled with terror, but with a cold, hard hatred that was as absolute as the rock beneath her. "You will not have it," she said, her voice low and venomous.
Not now. Not ever.
Saunders looked surprised by her tone. He had expected tears, pleading. Not this. "It is over, Mrs. Monroe," he said, reloading his rifle with a calm, methodical click. "It is just beginning," she retorted. She scrambled to her feet, a wild, desperate plan forming in her mind. To stay here was to die. To run was impossible. The only path left was the one she had run from. She backed away toward the far side of the ledge. "I am going back to Dry Creek," she announced, her voice echoing with a terrible clarity. "I am going to show everyone my husband's map. I am going to show them my deed, and I am going to tell them how a United States Marshal tried to murder me in these mountains to steal my land." Saunders laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You a disgraced woman who ran off with a savage, who will believe you?" "They will," she said, a cold certainty settling in her heart, "because I am not running anymore." She turned and began to scramble down the treacherous backside of the cliff, a path that was more of a controlled fall than a climb. Saunders shouted for his men to get her, but the terrain was too difficult for a quick pursuit. His priority was securing his claim. He walked over to where Tahan lay, prodding him with the toe of his boot. The Navajo was alive, barely, his breathing shallow and ragged. "Tie him up." Saunders ordered his men. "We will take him back. He can stand trial for his crimes before he hangs. It will all be very legal." He watched as Eleanor disappeared from view, a small, determined figure descending into the canyons. He was not worried. A lone woman, on foot. With no supplies, she would be a minor nuisance at best. His arrogance was his greatest weakness. He did not see the woman who had fled from him a week ago. He saw only a hysterical widow. He did not see the fire he had ignited in her soul. Eleanor did not look back. Her world had narrowed to a single, burning purpose. Every step she took, every rock she scrambled over, was fueled by the image of Tahan falling, of the blood on the red stone. She was no longer running for her life. She was walking back to a war. The law was coming to Dry Creek, but it was not riding with the marshal. It was walking in the worn-out boots of a woman who had nothing left to lose, and everything to fight for. The journey back to Dry Creek was a pilgrimage through hell. Eleanor walked with the image of Tahan's fall burned into her mind, a vision that fueled her when exhaustion threatened to claim her. She moved with a purpose that was as hard and unyielding as the rock beneath her feet. She was no longer a widow or a victim. She was a weapon, honed to a single, sharp point. She arrived not as the woman who had fled, but as a specter of dust and vengeance. Her dress was torn, her face was gaunt and scratched, and her eyes held the wild, unnerving clarity of someone who had looked into the abyss and had not blinked. She walked down the center of the main street, and the town, for the first time, fell utterly silent at the sight of her. People stopped in their tracks. They stared from doorways and windows, their mouths agape. This was not the respectable Mrs. Monroe. This was a primal force, a woman who had been stripped of everything but her will. She did not stop until she reached the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller was inside, looking surprised and deeply unhappy to see her. Before he could speak, she placed her palms flat on his desk. "Marshal Saunders is a murderer and a thief," she said, her voice a low, steady rasp. "He tried to kill me in the mountains. He shot Tahan, and he is coming back here to steal my land." The sheriff looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Eleanor," he began, his voice placating, "you have been through a terrible ordeal." "I have," she cut him off, "and I am not finished yet. I have the deed to my land and a map showing the gold my husband found. Saunders knows about it. That is why he burned my eatery. That is why he is trying to kill us." Her words, so bald and direct, hung in the small, stuffy office. The sheriff was a simple man, a man who dealt with drunks and petty thieves. This was beyond him. He was out of his depth, and his face showed it. Just then, the sound of riders came from the end of the street. It was Saunders and his men. They rode with a swaggering confidence, leading a single horse behind them. Slumped over the horse's saddle, his hands bound in front of him, was Tahan. He was alive, but barely. His head hung low, and his shirt was stiff with dried blood. Saunders dismounted, a triumphant smirk on his face as he saw Eleanor. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying across the street. "The prodigal widow returns. I see you have been telling stories." He gestured to Tahan. "I have apprehended the fugitive who abducted you and attempted to assault my person. He will be held for trial." A crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. They saw the captured Navajo, the formidable marshal, and the wild-looking widow. They pieced together the story that suited their prejudices, the one Saunders was now providing. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the onlookers. Martha Gable stood at the front, her face a mask of vindicated righteousness. "This will not be a proper trial," Saunders announced. "Taking charge. There is no judge in this town, but we will have a public hearing. Justice must be seen to be done." He looked directly at Eleanor, his eyes full of malice, "and all the facts will be brought to light." The hearing, as he called it, was a spectacle. He had it set up in the dusty open space in front of the saloon, under the full, brutal force of the afternoon sun. There was no courtroom, no jury box. There was just the hostile, sweating crowd. The makeshift authority of the sheriff's desk dragged into the street, and Saunders, who presided over the whole affair like a king. They had taken Tahan and locked him in an empty stall in the livery stable. The doors left open so the town could see him. He was a caged animal on display. They had not cleaned his wound or given him water. He sat on the dirty straw, his back against the rough planks, his head bowed. He had not looked at Eleanor once. He seemed to have retreated to a place deep within himself, a place of silent endurance where they could not reach him. Saunders began the proceedings by laying out his version of events. He painted Eleanor as an unstable woman, grieving and irrational, who had fallen under the sway of a manipulative savage. He described her visit to the Navajo camp as a scandalous betrayal of her late husband's memory. He claimed Tahan had filled her head with lies about gold and had abducted her, forcing him to mount a heroic rescue. Then he called on Eleanor. She walked forward, through the jeers and hateful whispers of the crowd, and stood before the desk. The sun beat down on her head. "Do you deny that you willingly went with this man into the wilderness?" Saunders asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "I did not go with him," she said, her own voice clear and steady, cutting through the noise. "We fled, together. We fled from you, because you tried to have him killed." A woman's voice, sharp and cruel, cut from the crowd. "She has no shame." It was Martha Gable. Saunders smiled. "And why would a United States Marshal want to harm this man?" "Because he stood in your way. You wanted my land. You burned my eatery to get it. And when I would not leave, you decided to remove the one person who protected me." "Lies," Saunders said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "The ramblings of a hysterical female. What you need, Mrs. Monroe, is the protection of a proper guardian, not the attentions of a heathen. We all saw the way he looked at you. We all know what happens when a man like that gets a white woman alone. His touch is a defilement." A current of ugly agreement passed through the crowd. Eleanor felt their hatred, their revulsion, wash over her. But it no longer had the power to wound her. She looked past Saunders, past the angry faces, and her gaze found the livery stable. She could just see Tahan, a still, broken figure in the shadows of the stall. She thought of his hands, calloused and rough, but so gentle as they unlaced her corset, as they tended her wounds. She thought of his body shielding hers from the storm, from the bullet. She turned her gaze back to the crowd, and a fire burned in her eyes. "His touch," she said, her voice ringing out, clear and defiant, silencing the murmurs. "You want to talk about his touch? His touch pulled me from a fire while you all stood and watched. His touch built a door to shelter me. His touch was the only kindness I have known in this town since my husband died. If his touch is a crime, then let me be guilty all my life." A shocked silence fell over the square. No one had expected this. This was not a denial. It was a confession, a declaration of war against every rule their world was built on. She had drawn a line, not in the dust, but in their very souls, and she had dared them to cross it. Before Saunders could recover, she threw the rolled-up map and the deed onto the desk. "This is my husband's map," she declared. "This is the deed to my land. It is all legal. Let anyone who can read see that I am the rightful owner. Saunders has no claim. He is a liar and a thief." Saunders laughed, but it was a strained sound. "Forged papers," he scoffed. "Meaningless." "Is it?" said a new voice, a quiet, gravelly voice that carried a weight of its own. An old man stepped out from the crowd. It was Jebediah, a retired army quartermaster who had served with Eleanor's husband. He was a quiet man, respected for his honesty. He walked with a limp, a souvenir from a long-forgotten battle. "I can read a survey map," Jebediah said, his eyes on Saunders. "And I can read a deed. I was the clerk at the Territorial Land Office for 20 years. I saw Captain Monroe file this one myself. It is as solid as that mountain over there." Saunders' face paled slightly. "What would you know about it, old man?" Jebediah ignored him and looked at the crowd. "I also know a forger when I see one. A fella passed through here a month back, name of Quill, specialized in land grants, stayed at the saloon for 2 nights. Paid his bill with a gold eagle given to him by our marshal here." He squinted at Saunders. "And a few days before the fire, I heard the marshal talking to those 2 hired guns of his. He told them to make the fire look like an accident, and to make sure the widow was either scared off or shut up for good. I reckon I know what that means." The crowd was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of doubt, of shifting allegiances. Jebediah was one of them. He was not a hysterical woman or a savage. He was a man they knew, a man they trusted. His words had the solid, undeniable weight of truth. The story was changing. Saunders was no longer the hero. He was the villain. Saunders saw the shift. He saw his authority, his entire scheme, crumbling to dust. Panic flashed in his eyes. He made a move for the pistol on his hip. But Sheriff Miller, for once in his life, acted decisively. He drew his own weapon faster than anyone thought he could move. "Do not even think about it. Marshal," the sheriff said, his voice low and steady. Saunders froze, his hand hovering over his gun. He looked at the faces in the crowd, and he saw no allies. He saw only hard, accusing eyes. He was alone. His reign was over. "He is under arrest," the sheriff declared, "for arson, attempted murder, and fraud." The law had come to Dry Creek. Justice, of a sort, had been done. Saunders and his men were disarmed and locked in the town's 2 jail cells. Eleanor's relief was a dizzying, hollow thing. She had won. She had exposed him. She turned toward the livery, her heart aching to go to Tahan, to tell him it was over. But it was not over. Sheriff Miller, his face grim, stepped in front of her. "The marshal will be sent to the capital for trial," he said. "But the Navajo, that is a different matter. He resisted arrest by a federal officer. He fled custody. I have to charge him." "Charge him with what?" she cried, her voice raw with disbelief. "He did nothing wrong. He is a Navajo off the reservation without papers. Eleanor, by the law, that is vagrancy. And by running, he made himself a rebel. The charge is insurrection. It is out of my hands. He will be taken to Fort Defiance to be judged by the army." The bitter, tragic irony was a poison in her throat. She had won her land, her name, but she had lost him. She had saved him from Saunders' bullet only to hand him over to a system that would crush him just as surely. They brought him out of the stall. His hands were still bound. He walked with a painful stiffness, but his head was high. As they led him past her, his eyes finally met hers. In them, she saw no anger, no blame, She saw only a deep, profound sorrow, an understanding of a fate that had been written for them long ago. He had known it would end this way. He, a Navajo, and she, a white woman, could never win. Not in this world. Their victory was a handful of dust, blowing away in the relentless wind. The dust settled, but the air in Dry Creek remained thick with unspoken things. Eleanor had won. Marshall Saunders was in chains, his lies exposed, his greed laid bare for all to see. The townspeople, who had so recently scorned her, now offered her a grudging, awkward respect. They looked at her with a new kind of fear, the fear one has for a person who has been to the edge and returned, fundamentally changed. They brought her food and offered to help clear the last of the rubble from her land. They were trying to erase their own complicity, to rebuild the comfortable fictions they lived by. But Eleanor could not accept their peace offerings. They felt like ashes in her mouth. Her victory was a barren piece of ground. She had her deed, her map, her good name restored. But Tahan was in the town's other jail cell, his wound festering, his future a foregone conclusion. The army was sending a detail from Fort Defiance in 2 days to transport him. He would be taken back to the world of blue coats, the world that had destroyed his family, the world that would now sit in judgment of him for the crime of being a Navajo who dared to exist. She went to see him once. Sheriff Miller, his face a mask of weary duty, allowed it. The cell was dark and smelled of stale sweat and despair. Tahan sat on the floor, his back against the stone wall. Dr. Adams had been to see him, had cleaned and stitched the wound, but a fever was already setting in. His skin was hot and dry to the touch, and his eyes were clouded with pain. He looked at her as she knelt outside the bars, and, for a moment, the fog of his fever cleared. He saw the anguish in her face, the victory that was no victory at all.
"You should not have come back,"
he whispered, his voice a dry rasp.
"I could not leave you,"
she said, her own voice thick with unshed tears. "You did what you had to do," he said. "You fought. That is what matters."
"But I lost you."
His gaze was steady, even through the pain.
"You did not lose me. Eleanor, you found me. That is a different thing. You cannot lose what was never yours to keep."
We were two people walking a path that could never meet. We only shared the shade of the same rock for a little while. His words were a gentle, terrible truth. Their love was a thing of the canyons and the firelight, a brief, impossible bloom in a barren land. It could not survive in the harsh, unforgiving sun of this world. To try and hold it, to try and build a life upon it, would be to kill it, to turn its beauty into a source of constant pain and persecution. "I will not stay here," she said, a sudden, fierce resolve cutting through her grief. "I cannot. This land, it is just dirt. It means nothing now." "That is good," he said, a faint ghost of a smile touching his lips. "It was never the land you were fighting for. It was for the right to stand upon it. You won that. Now go and find a place where you can stand in the sun." He closed his eyes then, the fever pulling him back under. Eleanor stayed for a long time, just watching him breathe, memorizing the lines of his face. When she finally left, she knew what she had to do. She sold the land to Jebediah for a fraction of its potential worth. She did not care about the gold. She only wanted enough to buy a place on the wagon train that was passing through at the end of the week, heading west toward the greener lands of California. The old soldier understood. He took the deed with a solemn nod, his eyes full of a sad, respectful wisdom. He knew she was not just selling a property. She was cutting the last tie to a life that had become a prison. The night before the army detail was scheduled to arrive, a profound silence fell over Dry Creek. A new moon hid its face behind a thin veil of clouds. The town slept, exhausted by the week's drama, but in the lands outside the town, in the shadows of the red rock buttes, there was movement. The deputy who was supposed to be guarding the jail, a young callow boy named Billy, was found at dawn, sleeping soundly at his post. He claimed he had not heard a thing. The lock on Tahan's cell was not broken, but unlocked, the key still in the door. The cell was empty. Tahan was gone. There were no tracks in the dusty street, no sign of a struggle. It was as if he had simply turned to smoke and drifted away on the night wind. But the old ones in the town, the ones who had lived in this land for a long time, they knew. They said his people had come for him. They said the Navajo could walk between the raindrops and move as silently as shadows. The law had come to Dry Creek, but the ancient, wild magic of this land had had the final say. Eleanor heard the news as she was loading her few salvaged belongings onto the back of a large freight wagon. A part of her, the part that had been screaming in silent terror for 2 days, was flooded with a profound, overwhelming relief. He was free. He was with his people. He was wounded, but he was in a place where he could be healed, a place where he belonged. The other part of her ached with the finality of it. He was gone from her world forever. The wagon train pulled out as the sun began to rise. It was a long, slow procession of canvas-topped wagons, hopeful families, and weary cattle, a river of humanity seeking a new life. Eleanor sat on the hard wooden seat of the freight wagon, her back to Dry Creek. She did not look back. She had already said her goodbyes to the ashes of her eatery and the ghost of her husband. As the wagons began the long, slow climb up the first big hill that overlooked the valley, she felt an irresistible pull. One last time. She had to look one last time. She turned, her gaze sweeping over the small, dusty town nestled in the crook of the Red Mountains. The sunrise was a thing of terrible, breathtaking beauty. The first rays of light spilled over the eastern peaks, setting the clouds on fire. The sky was awash in streaks of deep, blood red and brilliant, hopeful gold, blood and sunrise. It was the color of their story, the pain and the beauty, the sacrifice and the salvation, all painted across the vast, indifferent canvas of the sky. And then she saw him. He was standing on the crest of a distant ridge, a lone, dark silhouette against the fiery dawn. It was too far to make out his features, but she knew it was him. She knew it with every fiber of her being. He was not looking at the town. He was looking at her, at the wagon train that was carrying her away from him forever. Her heart seemed to stop in her chest. The world fell away. The creak of the wagon wheels, the lowing of the cattle, the chatter of the other travelers. It all faded into a muffled roar. There was only the sunrise and the man on the hill. He did not wave. He did not shout. He simply, slowly, raised his right hand and placed it flat over his heart. It was a gesture of immense stillness, of profound meaning, a sign of his people. She knew instinctively, a farewell that was more than a farewell. It was a promise that what had been between them was now a part of him, a piece of his soul that he would carry forever. It was an acknowledgement, a blessing, a release. It said, "You are in my heart. Go in peace." Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a love so powerful it transcended presence, so deep it did not need a future. She raised her own hand and placed it over her own heart, mirroring his gesture across the vast, empty space that separated them. She held it there, a silent answer, a final communion. They could not be together. The world would not allow it. Their love was an impossible dream, but in that impossible, forbidden love, they had found a salvation that neither of them had known they were seeking. He had saved her from a life of quiet, lonely despair, and she had saved him from a heart consumed by hatred and grief. He had broken the corset that bound her spirit, and she had given him a reason to live for something other than the ghosts of his past. The wagon crested the hill and began its descent on the other side. The ridge and the figure upon it disappeared from view. Eleanor finally lowered her hand. She turned her face to the west, toward the unknown lands, toward the new life she would have to build for herself. She was alone, but she was not empty. She carried his memory not as a wound, but as a secret strength, a quiet, steady flame in the deepest part of her heart. The sun was rising. and for the first time in a very long time, she was ready to meet the day. The river was a constant presence, a soft, murmuring voice that spoke of journeys and endurance. It was a sound so different from the dead, dusty silence of Dry Creek, here in this small, fertile valley carved by the water's patient hand. The world was green. Willow trees trailed their slender branches in the current, and ancient cottonwoods stood as silent, leafy sentinels. The air was soft, humid, and alive. A year had passed, a year of walking, of working, of slowly, painstakingly building a new life from the ashes of the old one. The wagon train had taken Eleanor as far as the great river, and she had gone no further. Something about this place, this bend in the water where the land was rich and the sky seemed wider, had spoken to her. She had bought a small plot of land with the last of her money and had begun to build. The Riverbend Eatery was not a large establishment. It was a simple, sturdy building of cottonwood planks, with a wide porch that looked out over the water. She had built it herself, with the help of a few kind settlers who had been intrigued by the quiet, determined woman who worked from sunup to sundown with a hammer and a saw. The sign she had painted was simple, the letters clear and steady. Inside, the room was clean and bright, filled with the scent of fresh bread, roasting meat, and the rich, dark aroma of coffee. Eleanor Monroe was no longer the woman who had lived in Dry Creek. The haunted, grieving widow was gone, replaced by a woman whose hands were strong and capable, whose gaze was direct and clear. The sorrow was still there, a deep, quiet pool within her, but it no longer threatened to drown her. It had become a part of her, like the color of her eyes or the way she stood, straight and tall, as if braced against a wind only she could feel. She was a woman who had been forged, not broken. The people of this new settlement, a place called Harmony, did not know her story. They knew only that she was a good cook, a fair businesswoman, and a woman who kept her own counsel. They respected her. She was a fixture in their small community, a point of stability and warmth. Travelers on the river would stop at her eatery for a hot meal and a moment of peace, and they would leave feeling rested and restored. In a quiet corner of the main room, away from the hustle of the tables, was a single, curious object. It was a smooth, weathered piece of driftwood that Eleanor had pulled from the river. Carved into its surface with a careful, steady hand was a symbol. It was a spiral, interwoven with a straight, ascending line, culminating in a small circle, like the sun. It was not a symbol most people recognized. Occasionally, a curious traveler would ask her what it meant. She would simply smile, a faint, sad, and beautiful expression, and tell them it was a reminder. She never explained further. She did not need to. The carving was for her. It was a promise she had made to a man on a distant hilltop, and to herself. She had asked an old Navajo woman she met on her journey what the symbol for living again was. The woman had drawn this for her in the dirt, a journey, an ascent, a new dawn. She never saw Tahan again. In the first few months, a part of her had expected him, had listened for the silent fall of a moccasin on her porch in the dead of night. Every lone rider on the horizon, every traveler who came from the east, carried with them a flicker of impossible hope. But as the seasons turned, as the green of summer faded to the gold of autumn and returned again, that sharp, painful hope softened into a quiet, enduring memory. She did not know if he was alive or dead. She did not know if his wound had healed, if he had found peace with the shattered remnants of his people. She had to believe he had. She had to believe that he was out there, somewhere, in the vast, wild lands that were his home, as free as the hawks that circled in the sky. To believe otherwise was a darkness she could not allow herself to enter. He had told her to find a place where she could stand in the sun, and she had, for his sake, and for her own. She had to live in that light. Her love for him was not a ghost that haunted her. It was a quiet, steady presence, a river that ran through the landscape of her soul. It had carved her into the woman she now was. It was a love that did not require possession to be real. It existed in the strength of her own hands, in the courage she found to face each new day, in the simple, profound act of building a life. Freedom, she had learned, was not just about escaping chains. It was about building something new in the place where the chains had been. One late afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the river, the bell above her door jingled. A lone traveler stood there, his figure silhouetted against the bright light. He was tall, his shoulders broad, his hair long and dark. For a single, heart-stopping moment, the world stood still. Time rewound, and she was back in a dusty, ruined street, staring at a man framed in firelight. The man stepped inside, and the illusion shattered. He was a trapper, his face weathered and bearded, his eyes a pale blue. He was a stranger. He was not Tahan. The familiar ache of what was lost and what could never be pricked at her heart. A gentle, bittersweet pang, but it was not followed by despair. She offered the man a warm smile, the genuine smile of a woman who had found a measure of peace. "Welcome," she said, her voice calm and kind. "You look like you have traveled a long way. Let me get you some coffee." She turned to the stove, her movements practiced and graceful. She took down a tin of coffee beans, the ones she always kept fresh, and began to grind them. The rich, familiar aroma filled the room. It was a ritual, a quiet ceremony she performed for every stranger who walked through her door. It was an offering, an act of faith. It was a way of honoring the man who had first come to her in dust and smoke, the man who had taught her that even in the darkest of nights, a single act of kindness could save a life. She poured the hot water over the grounds, the dark, fragrant liquid, a testament to the belief that even in the most desolate of places, something good and nourishing could be made. She was still waiting, not with the desperate hope of a girl, but with the patient, steady heart of a woman who knew that some loves were big enough to last a lifetime, even if they only ever truly lived in a handful of stolen moments. A silent farewell at sunrise, and the rich, hopeful aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from in the world so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales. Like the video, and press the hype button to support us and help this story reach more listeners.